This is a book review of Sufism by William Stoddart. The book, simply yet appropriately titled Sufism, written by William Stoddart, serves as a concise introduction to the world of Sufism. The book contains a foreword, introduction, and is then divided into chapters that can best be described as being separated by theme or dimension of Sufism. The foreword and introduction are where the author explicitly explains his motive behind the work. Stoddart all but states his frustration and explains that in today's age, advancing liberal thoughts are abandoning the more formal aspects of the major religious traditions. This philosophies for our times, as he says, is in essence the attempt to acquire the transcendent level of blessing associated with much of mysticism, but involves skipping the more traditional doctrines that benefit the individual with training, both spiritual and psychological, that is required. Stoddart isn't alone in at least parts of this argument. As Martin Lings also said, today Sufism is a name without a reality. It was once a reality without a name. The author explains that this movement is not new and does not solely pertain to Islam. But now that Islam has become the object of readaptation, there are those that are trying to experience Sufism without Islam, something Stoddart says cannot be done. Stoddart indeed drives the message home that there can be no Sufism without Islam. After all, it's the subheading for his introduction, and he expounds upon it often in that introduction. He compares it to having a body without life, comparing each aspect to the exoteric and esoteric, respectively, dimensions of Islam, and states that they cannot be separated. Stoddart then leaves this idea and moves into a section aimed at organizing and classifying religions. This section, of course, is really to explain Islam's place in the world to Westerners, which is arguably a well-needed section of the book, despite seeming out of place. He naturally concludes that, like Christianity and Judaism, Islam is monotheistic, universal, Semitic, adding to the irony of its forgotten status. Stoddart explains how the esoteric and exoteric realms of Islam relate with each other by drawing a picture of a circle. He explains that esotericism, or Sufism, is the center of the circle. Sharia, or the exoteric nature of Islam, is the circumference, and the radius drawn from circumference to the center is the mystical path. This picture is seen again in the three sections of the book. The first is a history and factual lesson of Islam, the Prophet, the Quran, and how Islam interacted with other religions like Christianity. Importantly, Stoddart does this with constant nods to Westerners, drawing analogies to make explanations specifically helpful, for example, relating Jesus to the Quran and Muhammad to Mary. Fittingly, the discussion moves to the Sufi part of Islam. He immediately addresses something that may seem paradoxical. Stoddart elaborates more on the Sufi-Sharia relationship and explains that Sharia is the physical representation of Sufism, and that Sufis are and should be the most apologetic in terms of conforming, at least outwardly, not inwardly. Stoddart doesn't ignore the fact that many Sufis were indeed in opposition to mainstream Sharia, and he even defends al-Hallaj, a famous intoxicated or moving too far away from mainstream Islam or abhorrent Sufi, by saying that he spoke with doctrines in mind and simply attained a high level of transcendence. Stoddart explains that this relationship cannot be avoided, and sometimes the very essence of inward and outwardness must conflict. Although most definitions of Sufi calls to mind an image of someone not following the status quo, the idea of Sufis being so focused on their outward celebration isn't a Stoddart exclusive, as other works claim Sufis were equally invested in tangible realms of physicality. Many aspects are still surrounded in debate, however, such as the origins and influence of other religions. Stoddart adamantly defends the idea that Sufism evolved solely from Islam and not from other religious influences, but at the same time takes a stance that other religions, like Christianity, also received other school of thought influence from sources like Neoplatonism. So there is really no such thing as having no outside influence. Other writers were more intent on explaining how Christianity impacted Sufism. Despite this, the chapter, very clearly, and through a famous quote from Titus Burckhardt, gives the in a nutshell explanation of Sufism, its important aspects, and its true emphasis on the Tawhid, or oneness of God. The book moves into a broad explanation of what religions hope to accomplish, salvation, but brings the focus back on Sufism and Islam. The message here was that for salvation, one must be initiated into that religion, and while Sufism doesn't exist within the Prophet's time, Muhammad used the initiation idea on only some of his followers, just as how only some Muslims are Sufis. The analogy of this to baptism is crucial, especially keeping in mind Stoddart's audience. He compares this initiation to baptism, but then explains what makes Christianity so exceptional, and hence why it is difficult for Westerners to understand. He claims it is odd for a religion to provide an esoteric initiation to everyone, especially infants, and explains that this baptism forces the esoteric goal to fill a social domain, therefore making baptism actually more like Sharia. Other scholars have claimed that Sufism is more universal than the image Stoddart provides, but still agree with its presence during the Prophet's time. Stoddart closes with more explanations of the mystic path, quite appropriate comparisons to other popular religions, and explaining how the very dynamic of following the path can be sexualized, but Sufism can reverse this and effectively removes that dynamic. There's also plenty of Sufi material, such as images, poems, and other writings presented to the reader to bring their experience full circle. Thank you.